So I wanted to draw your attention to my most recent book, Shakespeare Lied, which is available over here for sale. I'll show you the cover later. It's $20. It's my second book about Shakespeare's rhetoric. It is specifically linked Shakespeare with the Greek sophist Gorgias. It's actually called Gorgias. And also with Ovid. My theory is that Shakespeare believed that all art is a lie and that all art should not be didactic, i.e. that teach a moral lesson. But there is a lesson in my book for artists today, as I see playwrights, novelists, poets becoming more and more preachy and didactic, finger-wagging, political and moral ideas. But Shakespeare did not believe art should be about teaching. However, I'm not going to talk about Shakespeare Lied today. I am delivering a presentation based on an article I wrote for the most recent Oxfordian called Shakespeare at Palazzo Te. This article will also be the preface of my third book on Shakespeare, which I'm working on now. Its title is Shakespeare's Effeminacy. It deals, very controversial title, it deals not with Shakespeare's own personal effeminacy, but the attitudes to sex and sexuality in his work. There is a passage in Winter's Tale which scholars have studiously ignored over the years. Leontes is being told the story of the status of his dead wife, Hermione, and is told the princess, hearing of her mother's statue, which is in the keeping of Paulina, a piece many years in doing, and now newly performed by that rare Italian master, Giulio Romano, who, had he himself eternity, and could put breath into his work, would beguile nature of her custom. So perfectly he is her ape. He so near to Hermione hath done Hermione, that they say one could speak to her and stand hope of an answer, which of course happens in the play. This is the only time Shakespeare mentions a contemporary Renaissance artist anywhere in his work, I think. Why have scholars not done more research into this obviously key reference? I think it's because they're frightened of what they will find. And I think that fear actually motivates a lot of what we don't learn about. My Folger edition explains the reference by suggesting that Shakespeare must have read Vasari's Lives of the Artists in Italian, as Vasari says something very like what Shakespeare says. He says, Jupiter saw sculptured and painted bodies breathed by the skill of Giulio Romano. The inadequacy of this explanation exemplifies the sad excuse for scholarship that so often masquerades as academic rigor. There has been very little mention of Giulio Romano, paid by Shakespeare scholars. One exception is Oxfordian Michael Delahoyd, who mentions that the painting described in Shakespeare's poem, The Rape of Lucrece, sounds very much like a painting that exists in the hall of the Sala de Troia, and which is actually not in Palazzo Te, but is very close to Palazzo Te, in another building, in a palace, Gonzaga Palace. This is the description of the painting in Shakespeare's Lucrece, and this is the painting done by Giulio Romano at Palazzo, in the palace, that Delahoyd thinks is the subject of the description. For such an imaginary work was there, conceit deceitful, so compact, so kind, that for Achilles' image stood his spear gripped in his armed hand. Himself behind was left unseen, except in the eye of the mind. And you can kind of see Achilles there with the raised arm, and his head is quite hidden. Palazzo Te is an amazing castle designed by Giulio Romano in Mantua. The construction took from 1525, 9 years, to 1534. John Hamill, another Oxfordian scholar, has suggested that Mantua must have been visited by Edward de Vere. It's important to note that Mantua is not the setting for any plays, but it's mentioned in a couple of plays. I think one of them is Romeo and Juliet. The man from Stratford that we all know and love so much, he would have had no opportunity to go to this castle. But Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, because he visited Europe for 16 months at the age of 25, spent a significant amount of time in Italy. And as a representative of one of the oldest and most noble families in England, he would likely have been cordially welcomed, because that's what they did at Palazzo Te. They invited nobles from all around the world to come there, and Italy was doing this all over, actually, and educate them with their wonderful art and various things. Here's an erotic drawing of a sexual position, I'm not sure quite what it is, created by Giulio Romano for a collection of scandalous poems by the poet Aretino. John Hamill tells us that more than any other artist, Giulio Romano helped propagate the erotic style of art so fashionable during the 17th century, and it is mainly through his influence that religious painting in Europe declined after 1600. So isn't this a good reason to maybe not want to talk about Giulio Romano as being the idol of Shakespeare? I would say so. Because I think that Shakespeare makes an unprecedented mention of Giulio Romano because Shakespeare's work was akin to Romano's in both style and purpose, and it isn't just about the eroticism, but that's definitely an aspect, because he was an ardent admirer of Giulio Romano. Palazzo Te was built as a pleasure palace for Frederico II Gonzaga, Marquis of Mantua, to enjoy with his mistress Isabella Bracetti, along with other like-minded royal guests. Much of the imagery in the paintings involves nudity and eroticism. The palace features a series of adjoining rooms where visitors could bathe in sensuous waterfalls. 4 vast interconnected buildings at Palazzo Te enclose a courtyard. The walls of these buildings are unlike most Renaissance walls. So I want you to listen to what I'm going to say very carefully, because this is one of the most mysterious and fascinating things about Palazzo Te. A lot of the windows are false. They don't open up. What use is that? And the space between the pillars is not uniform, but we go further. Some of the pediments are designed to appear as if they are falling apart. It's important to note that Romano was an architect who designed this building also. Some of the pediments appear to be falling apart at some of the walls. Notice that the triangular pediment above the opening at the bottom of the photo seems to be broken by the stone under it, and part of the border above it seems to have fallen. There are other irregularities. Some of the pillars and walls are decorated with plaster, rusticated in such a way to make them appear damaged and perhaps unstable. The arch brickwork, this is fascinating, that supports the palace rests in the lake, surrounding in such a way that the water level seems a bit too high. This offers the impression that the palace is in danger of flooding. All of these architectural features might serve the opposite purpose of most Renaissance architecture, that is to make the visitors feel stable. The Palazzo Te instead is built to make the visitor feel unstable, maybe even uncomfortable. Why? Giulio Romano was classified as a Mannerist visual artist, and I believe that Shakespeare was a Mannerist writer, and that has a lot to do with why he was drawn to Romano's work. I think people are afraid to associate Shakespeare with any artistic movement. They feel that it will diminish the work, the kind of thing that Michael Dudley was talking about, cancel his originality. But why should it? No great artist works completely alone. Shakespeare's influences were classical, and I would suggest he strongly felt the influence of Italian Mannerism. So what is Mannerism? Some Mannerists are not so famous, like Bronzino, but then there are other that's here, this is Bronzino, but there are other famous ones. Michelangelo and Raphael are often considered Mannerists. They were artists who had mastered the classical rules of Greek and Roman painters and sculptors, but they had decided to challenge those rules, not just blindly follow them. For instance, Mannerist paintings often featured anatomically incorrect or unlikely images. So this is Madonna with a long neck. Couldn't fit her in there. That's how long her neck is. Or they feature bodies that are contorted in extreme ways, twisted like Michelangelo's Bound Slave. Caravaggio's use of exaggerated light and dark, called chiaroscuro, is another example of Mannerist technique. These techniques have much more in common than merely a challenge to classical painterly orthodoxy. They are basically anti-classical. They offer a philosophical challenge to the aesthetic objectivity assumed by Greek and Roman art. Classicism takes it for, so what is that objectivity? Classicism takes it for granted that we all understand reality in the same way, whereas Mannerism and anti-classical art reminds us again and again that everyone's viewpoint is different. Here's a quote from Arthur Holmes. The whole bent of anti-classical art is basically subjective, since it would construct and individually reconstruct from the inside out, from the subjective outward, freely, according to the rhythmic feeling present in the artist, while classic art, socially oriented, seeks to crystallize the object for eternity by working out from the irregular from what is valid for everyone. Another technique that was discovered by Renaissance painters and incorporated into high Renaissance paintings that is classically inspired. So I would call high Renaissance the classical painting where all reality is the same. It has to do with the vanishing point, which was discovered during the Renaissance. The interesting thing is that some Mannerist painters actually challenge perspective, and their paintings have a very flat look, or as in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, looks as if the figures are floating in space. It's important to speak of perspective. So I'm going to do this little, because it's relevant to Palazzo Te, it's relevant to Shakespeare and to Giulio Romano, but this is the most dense discussion, so just hold on to your chair, okay? Renaissance, and it's hard to describe this, but Renaissance Mannerists understood that the vanishing point was deemed the very height of objectivity, as I said, and what that means in plain English is that everyone looks at the world in the same way. Through perspective, there's always a vanishing point. Things get smaller when they're further away. Everyone sees the world the same way, but interestingly, though perspective suggests that we see things in the same way, there is a way in which perspective also accents the subjectivity, the individual, not the general. So this is a painting of the very complicated technique that Brunelleschi used to discover. This is how he illustrated the way it worked. And he had a real building, he's looking at it, and I think it's a kind of camera, well, anyway, not a modern camera, but he's looking through it. He's got a painting that is faced away from him with a hole in it, and then there's a mirror. It's very complicated. And then he sees the painting of the building reflected in the mirror, and then it replaces the actual building, because it's been done in perspective. So you actually, this was to show, but what it show how a vanishing point worked. But notice that the eye appears in the middle of the hole. Your own eye appears back to you. So there are two cones that we associate with perspective, and I'm promising you it doesn't get more complicated than this. One cone widens when it is close to us. It is the technique used to draw things in perspective. And the other cone starts at the object we're viewing and comes to our eye, and so it's wider further away from us. You will notice that Shakespeare talks about the eye, especially when speaking about love and whether the eye sees clearly or not in love. As Joel Feynman says in his essays about the sonnets, Cupid shot the arrow through the lover's eye into the lover's heart. This is a specifically visual desire. It is as something of the eye that the young man's fair appearance lies within the poet's heart. But notice that even in these early sonnets, the poet plays with the word, from the first sonnets, he plays with the word lie to ask, is appearance to be trusted? After all, the boy's fair appearance lies. It isn't just one person's subjective. Is it just one person's subjective view that this young man is beautiful, or is he deeply beautiful inside? So what's all the point of this talk about perspective? Finally, we're done. This essay intends to prove that as a Mannerist, Romano was aware of the vanishing point's implications for subjectivity and what he considered to be perspective's false claim of offering a supremely objective representation of reality. This is because Romano's primary concern as an artist was, as Shakespeare's, with unsettling the viewer's confidence in his or her point of view. Remember the Palazzo Te? I just love this shot. We've got that tiny little thing just kind of falling, right, at the top. This building's falling apart. Help! Mannerists and Shakespeare, too, I think, wanted to reflect the notion that the subject, that is you and me, the viewers of the art and the world, are on very shaky ground, because there are many different ways to view the world. In his book, Shakespeare and the Mannerist Tradition, Jean-Pierre Macquarlot classifies Shakespeare as a Mannerist writer and says that Julius Caesar is one of Shakespeare's most Mannerist plays because of the many different points of view that are weighed by the characters and the audience with no ultimate outcome as to what is the right answer. He says, a succession of images, in turn positive and negative, disconcerts the spectator to the extent that he or she can no longer situate the characters on a scale of moral values. I also now will consider the Mannerist technique called trompe-l'oeil, nothing to do with that horrible man. We will see that Romano used trompe-l'oeil painting technique. This is a 19th century painting, this isn't Romano, in which it looks like the boy's climbing out of the frame, right? That's because they're capable in trompe-l'oeil. From one angle, if you look at it, it looks absolutely real. It looks 3D, or maybe like a sculpture or something, but it looks 3D. From other points of view, it doesn't. And he's playing with it here. Now, Hamlet is an example of a character who constantly changes his viewpoint on things. He provides, all by himself, many conflicting ways of looking at things. Hamlet's brain I'm suggesting, seems to operate as a kind of trompe-l'oeil because he is constantly changing his mind. Macquerelot also speaks of the marriages at the end of the comedies. Now, I don't know if any of you have noticed these things. This is particularly in Twelfth Night. But in so many of the comedies, you end up with all these people and like men and women on stage, and they're you don't even know some of them. They just turned up, right? And then they suddenly fall in love and get married with someone. And then the play's over, and we're happy and we applaud, right? And so people will criticize the plays. I mean, and I've got the scene here with the, I guess it's Sebastian, is it? Who comes into Olivia. But it's like, what's suggested here is that, by Macquerelot, is that Shakespeare knew what he was doing, which is very important. Actually, that helps, I think, to understand Shakespeare a lot, is to think that he knew what he was doing. There weren't accidents. So what he was doing was pointing to the contrivance in the play. He's showing off. Hamlet shows off, Shakespeare shows off. Look at me, look what I can do. Look at how brilliant I am. When Mannerist painters elongate their figures, regardless of, this is a quote from verisimilitude, or employ rare, unconsciously unrealistic colors, the bright colors here, what are they doing if not calling attention to the contrived nature of the work? Holmes quotes Shearman, Mannerist works of art are conceived in the spirit, this is an obvious example of that kind of Mannerist work, in the spirit of virtuoso performances. And this display of virtuosity accentuates the all-consuming godlike power Mannerism has given the artist. The artist does not just imitate reality or record it, he creates it. And the creation does not just match reality, it surpasses it. As Holmes says, the artist's will is the ultimate force of the creative process, and his idea is truer than what he sees. The idea of an artist who creates something more than reality itself is one that can be found in the Book of the Courtier. I'm going to talk about that book too. Oh dear. Scholars have often considered the Book of the Courtier, we've said that we know what it is. Castiglione speaks of sprezzatura, or nonchalance, the idea that the courtier creates a beautiful illusion but never betrays how much work it took him to create it. Edward Revere wrote, well, we know he wrote the introduction, and he says, and I'm going to give you another quote from that introduction. And he's talking about the courtier now and his manners. And so, although nature herself has made nothing perfect in every detail, yet the manners of men exceed in dignity that which nature has endowed them. And he who surpasses others has here surpassed himself and has even outdone nature, which by no one has ever been surpassed. So what he likes about the perfect courtier is that he creates a reality that is completely artificial but truer than truth. And this idea comes up in Venus and Adonis when Shakespeare is describing a horse. Look, this isn't the painting, but when a painter would surpass the life in limning out a well-proportioned steed, his art with nature's workmanship at strife, as if the dead, the living, should exceed, so did this horse excel a common one in shape, in courage, color, pace, and bone. It is likely when Shakespeare wrote this passage, he was thinking about Palazzo Te. The Hall of the Horses, the Sala de Cavalli, is the first room that visitors to the Palazzo Te encounter. Is the only room that is called a hall. Several paintings of horses adorn the walls. You look up, they're high up, and you see them here, how real they look, but they actually, they look completely 3D. They're absolutely real, but at the same time false, because if you look at them from another angle, it's trompe-l'oeil. They're not so real. So while the Sala de Cavalli, so that's the first room I'm going to talk about, speaks to the philosophical implications of Shakespeare's Mannerist aesthetic, the Sala de Psyche, Chamber of Cupid and Psyche, speaks to the aesthetic as well as Shakespeare and Romano's radical views on sex and sexuality. Several of the rooms at Palazzo Te are inspired by Ovid's Metamorphosis, the Sala de Psyche, the Chamber of Ovid, the Sala de Giganti. It goes without saying that Ovid's poetry brims with eroticism. Most scholars agree that Ovid was Shakespeare's favorite poet. We know this. What was Shakespeare's attitude to sex and sexuality? This is when I deal with my third book. Scholars often note with some embarrassment the endless array of often seemingly irrelevant dirty jokes and double entendres in her plays, but all Shakespeare's characters, as usual, do not have the same views about sex and sexuality. First of all, there's uptight Malvolio, in Twelfth Night, who is ridiculed by Maria as some kind of Puritan. And yet Shakespeare lets Thersites, and obviously a raunchy little production of Troilus and Cressida, give eloquent voice to the Puritan view. Lechery, lechery, still wars and lechery. Nothing else holds fashion, a burning devil take 'em. So this clue to Shakespeare's attitude to success, the clue to Shakespeare's attitude to success, excuse me. So you've got two opposing views there. He's dissing Puritanism in one play, and in another play he's saying, the world is filled with lechery. So how do we figure out what his attitude is? Well, I think one of the way we can find it is through Shakespeare's comedies, which are carefully constructed with loving pairs that are very significant. So Touchstone, we have different levels of love expressed in the characters in these plays. So in, what play are we in now? As You Like It, right? Touchstone and Audrey. Touchstone quips to his partner, the loose girl Audrey, well, praise be the gods for thy foulness. Sluttishness may come hereafter. Yeah, he's a very pleasant character there. And then we go to the next one, and we're a bit higher up in the scale, right? We've got Sylvius and Phoebe, and Sylvia's speeches to Phoebe are just a bit much, but he's trying to love her in a very beautiful way. He says, so holy and so perfect is my love that the main harvest reaps loose now and then a scattered smile, and that I'll live again. Live upon. But then, of course, we get to Rosalind and Orlando, and Rosalind says, believe then, if you please, that I can do strange things. I have, since I was 3 years old, conversed with a magician, most profound in the art, and yet not damnable. In Shakespeare and Platonic Beauty, John Vivian defines the Neoplatonic principle of the recognition of immortal companions. People are in perfect love in heaven first, but when they get to earth, they sometimes don't recognize each other. It is up to the discerning lover to discriminate between the mere physical love and the combined spiritual and material beauty of the immortal companion. As Vivian notes, this dilemma is central in many of Shakespeare's comedies. Sebastian Velda's twin, in that scene I was talking about before, speaks about what the spirit is in terms of the body. He says, as spirit I am indeed, but am in that dimension grossly clad, which from the womb I did participate. So that's one of those turnaround sentences that people who don't like Shakespeare don't like. But basically what he's saying is that, I'm a soul, but I've got this body, which, my mother made it on me, and I have to walk around with this body. Sorry. Let's go to the Sala de Psyche. Romano takes us on the same Neoplatonic journey as Shakespeare does, from material beauty to the beauty of the soul, telling Ovid's story of Cupid's Psyche. As Michaeldus says, this philosophy is mainly captured through their narration, with the path of the labyrinth followed by Psyche, which represents the human soul. While she is in an intermediate state in the world of ideas, represented by the octagons, she falls with Eros and the material body. Only through much effort does she manage to reach the top in the center of the ceiling, achieving eternal immortality. Let's look at the next painting. Here you go. Hold on to your hats. This one's pretty explicit. The subtitle explains what's going on here. Olympus is seduced by Jupiter, whose thunderbolt is seized by an eagle, who drills the eye of the jealous king of Macedonia. So hopefully you can see in the corner there, you can see Jupiter right there, obviously Jupiter and Olympus. But then if you look in the upper right-hand corner, you can see that's the jealous husband. And what's kind of interesting is that there is an eagle holding a... there's what is it? I don't know what it is exactly, but something going into the eye of the king who is observing his wife having sex with someone else. And there's also this cone you can see there that opens up. So, what is the meaning of this arrow? It clearly implicates the viewer. By placing an erotic spy in the painting, Romano has commented on the act of voyeurism. As Carabel says, by making clear the presence of a second male figure, in so doing, he ruptured a bond that had prompted compensatory pleasure and made this an image of insatiable desire. Frederico, the guy who owned the palace, inevitable exclusion from the activities of the amorous duo is, of course, a function of Giulio's compositional strategy. Cast in profile, Philip serves as a surrogate for the covetous spectator. So that, in plain English, is that he didn't just paint the couple having sex or making love or whatever you want to call it. He painted the husband looking on, and that's to implicate the viewer and say, you're looking at this? What does it mean? What kind of person does that make you, that you're sitting here looking at this in this palace with all its sensuous waterfalls and everything? In his analysis of the sonnets, Feynman calls this lover's... pardon me for swearing. Where did I go? No. Yeah, and so I'm going to move on. Oh, yeah. So Carabel sees the cone in there as opening up, and it sees it as a reference to perspective. In his analysis of the sonnets, Feynman calls the lover's gaze in Shakespeare's poetry Shakespeare's perjured eye, because Shakespeare's attitude to love and sex is both complex and paradoxical. We have to notice that Venus is pretty filthy in Venus and Dust. This is a nearly pornographic poem, or it depends on your point of view. But she says, for instance, graze on my lips, and if those hills be dry, stray lower where the pleasant fountains lie. I wonder what in heaven's name she's talking about. Dare we ask? Then there is Shakespeare's description of sex in Sonnet 129 as the expense of spirit in the waste of shame. And by the way, I just slipped in a sexy picture of, who is this? Michael Fassbender from the movie Shame. It's very relevant. Okay. Shakespeare, I want to say that Shakespeare has ambivalent feelings about sex and love. And I think it's expressed all this is expressed in an early poem by Edward de Vere, The lively lark stretched forth her wing. Here a young man meets Desire, who happens to be a beautiful young knight, in this case, who informs him, and they walk together, and who informs him that Desire loves nothing better than to see a man who is sexually frustrated. In other words, then of Desire I asked again, and what thing did please and what did pain? He smiled, and thus he answered, then Desire can have no greater pain than forced to see another man that he desireth to obtain, nor greater joy can be than his, than to enjoy that others miss. But there is no more eloquent symbol of Shakespeare's conflicted attitude to sex and the male gaze than his obsession with the legend of Actaeon. This, by the way, is the cover of my book, and the reason of my Shakespeare Light. It is a sculpture of Actaeon. In Ovid's tale, a young hunter is tempted when he accidentally catches sight of the goddess Artemis, read Diana, bathing naked. To punish him, Artemis turns Actaeon into a stag. She also sets his own hounds on him. He is then ripped apart by his own dogs. Many, many characters in Shakespeare's work are hounded by the dogs of their desire. There are at least 5 direct references to Actaeon in Shakespeare's work, including As You Like It, Titus Andronicus, Twelfth Night. I've got a couple of them here. There's one in Titus, is referred to directly, of course, in Titus, and then very much so also in Twelfth Night. We can be sure that let's continue along. Oh, I went too fast, sorry. That was supposed to be a surprise. Okay, so now we get to the final room I want to show you, the Sala Giganti, which is certainly climactic. Is undoubtedly meant to be the penultimate aesthetic experience of the Palazzo Te. And here it is. Ta-da. We can be sure that the Sala Giganti was on Shakespeare's mind because, as John Hamill notes, he makes a reference to the Sala Giganti in apparently a quarto of Love's Labour's Lost, an early quarto. He says, this senior Giulio's giant dwarf Don Cupid. Standing in that room, this is the room here, Shakespeare would no longer merely be a spectator, but experience the wonder of being in the presence of God, or perhaps more accurately, the gods, and would quite literally sense the ground shifting under his feet. The Sala Giganti illustrates a chapter from Ovid's Metamorphosis in which the giants attempt to attack Jupiter, but of course Jupiter sends down thunderbolts and does away with them. When the viewer enters the room, he or she enters a painting. At the base of the painting, the giants are being crushed by falling arches and columns and everything. Far up, above in the clouds, the gods are in a frenzied disarray as Jupiter hurls down his revenge. It's a kind of a trick, a masterful slice of showing off. For although the chamber itself is not that large, the feeling is that a vast universe is crashing down upon you. Carabel says, the viewer is dwarfed by the image that surrounds him. As Vasari and his successors implicitly realized, the chamber's cycloramic structure was a decentering feature. Even in a pleasure palace like Palazzo Te, the integrity of the individual remained always far from secure. So this room is finally an example of the most insecure you're going to feel. There'll be things about, the art that I pointed out with the arrow in the eye and the person watching the sex scene or whatever. But when you come in here, suddenly you're like, who am I? What am I? I'm just nothing. I think I'm going to fall down. Does all this remind you of anything? All this destruction, the viewer coming in and feeling suddenly wrapped in a scene where everything's falling apart. Does it remind you of a Shakespeare play that starts with an awful storm? In The Tempest, Shakespeare stipulates that cries and sounds come from the backstage to make the passenger's desperation more realistic. He says there's a confused noise within. Mercy on us, we split, farewell. My wife and children, farewell, brother, we split. So you are I suggest, and I kind of think that he got the idea from the Sala to Giganti, right? Maybe not, but it certainly fits in with the same aesthetic, which is you're going to take the audience at the beginning of the play and make them feel as if their world is falling apart. And it's kind of an ultra-realism. But, of course, this magic is created in the play by Prospero, who continues alternately torturing and terrifying his enemies out of what seems partially a personal grudge and partially an earnest attempt to redeem the villains. Mixed feelings about... I did that. Sorry. That really shows the destruction in the Sala di Giganti. Some critics challenge Prospero's virtue. Indeed, Prospero himself identifies with the basis character in the play. I love this quote, Caliban, when he says, "This thing of darkness I acknowledge mine." Why does it matter what we think about Prospero? Because Prospero is undoubtedly a Mannerist artist who, like Shakespeare, creates fiction so real that they paralyze us with their with fear, dazzling us with their and the magician is dazzling us with his virtuosity. Critics have lately. Oh boy, I think I skipped a slide. I'm not being very good here. Okay. Critics have lately branded Prospero a colonialist. Well, of course, Prospero is a colonialist, as is Shakespeare, if one looks at him through a modern lens. But he is part artist. Prospero is part artist, part magician, part manipulator. I want to add another model for Prospero because I think it will feed into understanding Shakespeare as an artist who was constantly interested in showing off his contrivance. And that is Giambattista della Porta. He was not only a practical natural magician, but a playwright. Della Porta wrote 17 plays. They were available in England in Italian and are often described today as Mannerist, mainly because of the artificial quality of the dialogue and the contrived nature of the stories. I've read a little bit of some of them. I'm not very good with reading things other than Shakespeare. And I found it, his plays I didn't like them. But they're like, they're not like Shakespeare because they're completely contrived and they're completely crazy, really. I guess they might be funny. They're interesting in certain ways. But anyway, they're like Shakespeare's comedies in some ways. As Codera says, the labyrinthine pattern should appear hopelessly, so that everything's in a mess, hopelessly frustrating, and suddenly resolved by a final peripety, a coup de théâtre, with unexpected and satisfying dramatic impact, producing order out of chaos and a happy ending all around. Many of these intricate ruses are echoed in Shakespeare's comedies, such as Twelfth Night and The Merry Wives of Windsor. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy makes Della Porta sound very much like Prospero. Porta's Magus is a decidedly male figure who unites the physical dexterity of the trickster, the experience of the alchemist, the erudition of the humanist, the astrologer's command of mathematics, and the intuitive knowledge of the psychic medium. The Magus, must be rich, talented, educated, hardworking. Magic is the most noble part of philosophy for Porta. Instead of a priest or a metaphysician in quest of the divine, as in Pico della Mirandola or John Dee, Porta's Magus is thus depicted as an artifex. Never heard that word. A craftsman or mastermind who knows how to manipulate the natural and occult properties of certain bodies. The fact that Della Porta may have been one of the models for Prospero is important because it accentuates that Prospero, like any artist, is both a very godlike human and a very human god. When Prospero attempts to obstruct the courtship of Ferdinand and Miranda, he sounds as much like a villain contemplating evil manipulations as a playwright crafting a plot or a gentle god guiding people. He sounds like all these things. And this kind of magic that Prospero does resembles one of Della Porta's famous tricks. So what he would do, as I understand it, is he would get a table and he would have metal figures on the table. And then they would be a lodestone, which I think is a magnet, underneath. And then he would, of course, the magic. He would make them fight. He would make these little figures, like chess figures, fight on the board. In this natural theater, this is a quote, the magus is pulling the strings from behind the scenes, much to the amazement of the observers, very much like Prospero. Perhaps the difficulty we have in deciding whether or not Prospero is a good person is related to his godlike qualities. For if Prospero were a Christian god, he would necessarily be good, but pagan gods had human failings. But even more importantly, there were one other thing, these pagan gods. Neoplatonists defined gods as artists. As John Vivian tells us, the qualities they bestow on the soul are, of course, ultimately God-given by imparting to stubborn matter the physical beauties that correspond to their essential celestial gifts. They work as artists. So for the Neoplatonists, gods are artists. And that has to relate to what you were hearing just in the previous talk about beauty and the importance of beauty. In this way, the Sala de Giganti in Palazzo Te reflects the metaphysical center of Shakespeare's world. For without a doubt, Prospero in The Tempest is Romano, the Mannerist, as much as he is Shakespeare himself. He is also a pagan god, acting sometimes without reason. And Shakespeare knows that it is necessary for us to come to terms with this kind of terror that a god can create. This is the purpose of Shakespeare's art. There I go, I'm telling you the purpose of Shakespeare's art. To induce us to confront the terrifying paradox that is life and death. Palazzo Te exemplifies Shakespeare's vision of the artist as a trauma-inducing hurtler of aesthetic thunderbolts. When Shakespeare first experienced the Sala de Giganti, he understood that his job, too, as an artist, was to deeply involve the audience with the goal in mind of implicating and unsettling them with his vision. Shakespeare mentions Giulio Romano in The Winter's Tale because his own worldview is identical with Giulio Romano's. It's not because he read it in Vasari's book. And with Mannerism in general. When Shakespeare slips Romano's name to this ancient lit fairy tale, so suddenly, inexplicably, and so casually, it's not only a reference to the godlike powers of the artist and the artistic powers of the gods. Shakespeare, like many Mannerist artists, is ultimately, as I keep saying, like the peacock, showing off. He's so proud of his creation and so assured of its ability to arrest our undivided attention under any circumstances that he thinks nothing of dropping into the play, as he does in many of his works, like, what are they, the clocks in Julius Caesar and various things, dropping these anachronisms and utterly, shockingly anachronistic detail for seemingly no apparent reason. But there is a reason. Shakespeare mentions only one contemporary visual artist by name in his play because from the moment Shakespeare placed an elegant Italianate shoe down in the grounds of Palazzo Te, he knew that Romano's soul-stirring, all-involving Mannerist masterpiece would allow him to finally rejoice in a sensibility identical to his own, one that was the incarnation and the visual corollary of what his written work would someday be. I ask you, whose interest does it serve? Why is this man laughing? To ignore Shakespeare's Mannerist aesthetic, his complex attitudes to sex and sexuality, and his skeptical, clearly pagan Neoplatonic metaphysic, especially when the evidence of it is staring us in the face. It's a question that I'm almost afraid to ask. Thank you.